I never knew a single photograph could destroy everything I believed about my family. My name is Eleanor Hartwell. I'm 58 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought my grandmother Catherine was exactly who she'd always claimed to be. A quiet British civil servant who spent the war filing paperwork in London. That illusion shattered the afternoon I found a leather-bound box hidden beneath floorboards in her Cotswolds cottage, sealed with wax that had remained unbroken for 70 years. Inside weren't the ration books or evacuation notices I expected. Instead, I discovered 23 letters written in elegant German script, each one more dangerous than the last. And tucked inside the final envelope, the one marked Niemals Offenen, never open, was a photograph that made my blood run cold. My grandmother, young and radiant, standing beside a man in a Wehrmacht officer's uniform, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, both of them smiling with the kind of desperate joy that only exists when tomorrow might never come. What I read in those letters changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the impossible choices war forces upon the human heart. You won't believe what I discovered. Let me start at the beginning. Bletchley Park, England. October 1942. The smell of cigarette smoke and machine oil hung perpetually in Hut 8, where Catherine Winters spent 14 hours each day breaking German naval codes. At 24, she possessed what her supervisor called an unnatural gift for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. A talent that made her invaluable to the war effort and utterly isolated from normal life. The other girls whispered about dances in London, about American pilots with easy smiles and chocolate bars. Catherine heard them as if from underwater, her mind always half submerged in the mathematical puzzles that could mean the difference between a convoy's safe passage and its destruction. She never expected to find poetry in an Enigma intercept. It arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, part of a routine batch of Wehrmacht communications from occupied France. Standard military traffic, troop movements, supply requisitions, weather reports. But buried in the mechanical language of war, Catherine found something that made her breath catch. A single line that didn't belong, hidden within coordinates that led nowhere. Die Nachtigall singt Mitternacht im Garten der Erinnerung. The nightingale sings at midnight in the garden of memory. It was beautiful. It was unnecessary. And it violated every principle of German military communication protocol. Someone was sending messages that weren't meant to be there. Catherine should have reported it immediately. Instead, she copied the phrase into her personal notebook, her hand trembling slightly as she formed the Gothic letters. That night, lying in her narrow dormitory bed, she translated it properly, searching for hidden meanings in the poetry. She found nothing, just a line of inexplicable beauty in the midst of mechanized death. The nightingale sang again 3 days later, then a week after that, each time in different messages, different contexts, always hidden within legitimate military traffic. Catherine began to wait for them, these small rebellions against the machinery of war. She imagined the sender, some homesick soldier, perhaps, or a clerk with literary pretensions, risking court-martial for the sake of beauty. She never imagined she would meet him. Occupied France. November 1942. Hauptmann Friedrich von Lehmann stood at the window of the requisitioned chateau, watching rain sweep across the Norman countryside. At 31, he wore his Wehrmacht uniform with the careful correctness of a man who no longer believed in what it represented, but lacked the courage to remove it. Before the war, he'd been a professor of literature at Heidelberg. Now he was an intelligence liaison officer, translating intercepted Allied communications and pretending not to notice as the regime he served descended further into madness. The Nightingale lines were his small act of resistance, messages to no one, meaning nothing, except that they proved something human could still exist within the Nazi war machine. He never expected anyone to notice them. The summons came on a gray December morning. Report to Bletchley Park under flag of truce for intelligence exchange. A routine matter, his commanding officer assured him. The British wanted clarification on certain communication protocols. Friedrich would go, answer their tedious questions, and return within 48 hours. Friedrich packed his bag with the sick certainty that nothing about this would be routine. Bletchley Park, December 15th, 1942. Catherine was told only that a German officer was arriving for technical consultation, and that her expertise in Wehrmacht communication patterns was required. She prepared herself for some gray-faced bureaucrat, another cog in the Nazi machine. Instead, she found herself across a table from a man with intelligent eyes and ink-stained fingers, who looked at the decoded messages spread between them with something that might have been shame. "The Nightingale passages," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "They serve no military purpose." "Why?" Friedrich met her gaze, and in that moment, something shifted. A recognition that passed between two people who'd spent too long translating other people's words and had forgotten how to speak their own truth. "Because," he said quietly in perfect English, "I needed to remember that beauty still exists, even in this." The consultation was supposed to last 2 hours. They talked until dawn. The official exchange lasted 3 days. Friedrich answered questions about German communication protocols with meticulous accuracy, providing just enough genuine intelligence to satisfy his British handlers while revealing nothing that could endanger lives. Catherine served as his primary interrogator, their conversations conducted in the sterile conference room under the watchful eyes of military intelligence officers. But on the second evening, something unexpected happened. An air raid siren split the December darkness. As personnel rushed to shelters, Catherine and Friedrich found themselves momentarily alone in the chaos, separated from their escorts in the blackout confusion. They stood together in a doorway, listening to the distant drone of Luftwaffe bombers, his countrymen, dropping death on her homeland. "I'm sorry," Friedrich whispered, and Catherine heard in those 2 words the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies, for the war, for the regime, for the impossible situation that had brought them together. "Don't," she said. "Don't apologize for things you can't control." In the darkness, his hand found hers. Just for a moment. Just long enough for both of them to understand that something had begun that could only end in tragedy. The official meetings continued, but now they found ways to exchange more than military intelligence. Friedrich began leaving books in the conference room, volumes of Rilke, Goethe, Heine, with passages marked that spoke of exile, doubt, and the cost of remaining silent in the face of evil. Catherine responded with English poetry, Donne, Keats, Wordsworth. Their real conversation happened in these marginalia, in the spaces between official words. On the final day, Friedrich's departure already arranged, Catherine made a decision that violated every security protocol she'd sworn to uphold. She wrote her personal address on a slip of paper. Not her Bletchley dormitory, but her family's cottage in the Cotswolds, the place she went on her rare leaves. "After the war," she said, pressing the paper into his hand. "When this madness ends, find me." Friedrich looked at the address as if it were a holy relic. Then he pulled a photograph from his wallet, himself in civilian clothes, standing in a university courtyard, looking young and unburdened by history. On the back, he wrote a single line, "Ich verspreche." "I promise. I will come," he said. "No matter what happens. No matter how long it takes. I promise I will find you." They both knew it was a promise the war would likely break. France. January 1943. Friedrich returned to occupied France carrying Catherine's address like a talisman. The Nightingale messages continued, but now they held new meaning. Each one a secret message to her, hidden where only she would recognize them. Catherine decoded them in the depths of night, translating not just the words but the longing beneath them. Der Winter ist lang, aber der Frühling wird kommen. The winter is long, but spring will come. Ich zähle die Tage bis zur Freiheit. I count the days until freedom. Vergiss mich nicht. Don't forget me. She never forgot. She carried his photograph in the lining of her coat, a secret more dangerous than any military intelligence she handled. If discovered, it would mean disgrace, imprisonment, accusations of treason. But she couldn't let him go. They found one more way to communicate. Through a neutral courier in Switzerland, a Red Cross worker who asked no questions. The letters took weeks to arrive, heavily censored, stripped of anything that might reveal military secrets. But between the blacked-out lines, they built a relationship that existed entirely in words. Friedrich wrote of his growing horror at what he witnessed. The deportations, the brutality, the systematic destruction of everything he'd once believed his country represented. He couldn't speak openly, but Catherine understood what he couldn't say. He was trapped in a uniform he despised, serving a cause that sickened him, lacking the courage to desert, but no longer able to serve with conviction. Catherine wrote of her own isolation, the burden of knowing too much, of holding secrets that could save lives but could never be shared. She told him about the nightmares, the weight of responsibility, the way she'd become a ghost in her own life, unable to connect with anyone who didn't understand the peculiar hell of Bletchley Park. In their letters, they were honest in ways they could be with no one else. Bletchley Park, June 1943, then came the message that changed everything. Catherine was working the night shift when she decoded a Wehrmacht communication that made her blood freeze. Friedrich's unit was being transferred to the Eastern Front, a death sentence dressed in military orders. Officers sent to Russia rarely returned. Hidden in the routine transfer orders, she found his final Nightingale message. Die Nachtigall schweigt. Der Garten ist verloren. The nightingale falls silent. The garden is lost. Catherine sat motionless at her station, the decoded message trembling in her hands. Around her, other codebreakers worked on, unaware that her world had just collapsed. She wanted to scream, to run, to do something, anything, to stop what was coming. But she was just a codebreaker, and he was just a German officer. And the war ground on, indifferent to their impossible love. That night, she wrote him one final letter, knowing it would likely never reach him. I will wait. I don't care how long. I will wait for you to keep your promise. Come back to me. Please come back to me. She sealed it with the photograph he'd given her, returning it so he would have something to carry into the darkness of the Eastern Front. The letter never arrived. Eastern Front. August 1943. Friedrich's unit reached the outskirts of Stalingrad 3 weeks after the catastrophic German defeat. What remained of the Wehrmacht's Eastern Army was a hollow-eyed ghost of its former self. Men who'd seen hell and knew they were being sent back for a second tour. He carried Catherine's address in a waterproof pouch against his heart, along with the single letter that had reached him before communications collapsed entirely. He read it so many times the paper began to disintegrate along the fold lines, her words becoming as much a part of him as his own thoughts. I will wait. But Friedrich was no longer certain he would survive to keep his promise. The Eastern Front was where the Nazi regime's true face revealed itself without pretense. Friedrich witnessed atrocities that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. Villages burned, civilians executed, the systematic brutality that the regime called pacification. He was not required to participate directly, but his silence made him complicit. Every day he wore the uniform was another day he betrayed everything he'd once believed. In October, he made his decision, under cover of a Soviet artillery barrage. Hauptmann Friedrich von Lehmann walked away from his post and disappeared into the ruins of a shattered village. Desertion meant execution if caught, but staying meant becoming something he could no longer bear to be. He began the long journey west, traveling by night, stealing civilian clothes from abandoned homes, forging papers with skills learned in intelligence work. His goal was simple: reach neutral territory, survive until the war ended, and then find Catherine. But the war had other plans. Bletchley Park, November 1943. Catherine noticed the change in German communications from the Eastern Front. Increased chaos, breakdown in protocol, signs of a military structure collapsing under impossible pressure. She searched every decoded message for some trace of Friedrich, some sign that he'd survived. Instead, she found his name in a casualty list. Hauptmann Friedrich von Lehmann, missing, presumed dead, October 1943. The words blurred as Catherine stared at them. Around her, the machinery of Bletchley Park continued its relentless work, but she heard nothing except the roaring silence in her own head. Missing, presumed dead, not confirmed, not certain, but in the chaos of the Eastern Front, missing almost always meant dead. Frozen in a ditch, buried in a mass grave, lost to the vast machinery of industrial warfare. She should have reported finding his name, should have filed it away with the thousands of other casualties that crossed her desk. Instead, she carefully omitted it from her daily report, a small act of rebellion that could cost her everything. That night, alone in her dormitory, Catherine made a decision. She would wait as she'd promised, even if it was foolish, even if everyone told her to move on. She would wait until she had proof, real proof, that he was gone. She hid his photograph beneath the floorboards of her family's cottage, along with all his letters, sealing them in a leather box with instructions that they should never be opened. If she died before he returned, no one would ever know about their impossible love. It would remain her secret, buried with her. Switzerland, December 1943. Friedrich made it to the Swiss border more dead than alive, suffering from frostbite and pneumonia, delirious with fever. Swiss border guards found him collapsed in the snow and took him to a refugee hospital, where he spent 3 months recovering from his ordeal. When he was finally strong enough to think clearly, his first action was to try to contact Catherine. But communications between Switzerland and Britain were heavily restricted, monitored by intelligence services on both sides. Any letter he sent would be intercepted, read, analyzed. If British intelligence discovered that a German deserter was trying to contact one of their top codebreakers, Catherine would be arrested for treason. He couldn't risk her safety, not even to let her know he'd survived. Friedrich made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would wait until the war ended, then find her as he'd promised. It might take months. It might take years. But he would keep his promise. He had no way of knowing that Catherine believed him dead. Bletchley Park, June 1944. D-Day came and went. The Allies pushed into France. Victory, once impossible to imagine, now seemed inevitable. Catherine continued her work with mechanical precision, her gift for patterns undiminished, even as her heart remained frozen in that moment she'd seen Friedrich's name on the casualty list. Then came the incident that nearly destroyed everything. A new security officer arrived at Bletchley Park, tasked with investigating potential breaches. Major Thornton was efficient, thorough, and suspicious of everyone. He began reviewing old files, looking for patterns of unusual behavior. And he found Catherine's omission, the casualty report she'd failed to file, the German officer's name she'd deliberately hidden. "Miss Winters," Thornton said, his voice cold as he confronted her in a private office. "You're going to tell me everything about your relationship with Hauptmann von Lehmann. And then you're going to explain why you committed treason by concealing enemy intelligence." Catherine felt the walls closing in. On the desk between them lay her entire career, her reputation, possibly her freedom. Thornton had already been through her dormitory, though he hadn't yet found the cottage or the hidden letters. But he would. It was only a matter of time. "There's nothing to tell," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the terror flooding through her. "I made an administrative error. Nothing more." Thornton smiled without warmth. "We'll see about that. You're suspended from duty pending investigation. And Miss Winters? Don't even think about leaving Bletchley Park. I'll be watching." Bletchley Park, July 1940, for the investigation consumed 3 weeks of Catherine's life. Major Thornton interviewed everyone she'd worked with, reviewed every communication she'd handled, searched for any evidence of collaboration with the enemy. He was convinced she was a spy, or at the very least, compromised by emotional attachment to a German officer. He wasn't entirely wrong. Catherine maintained her story. Administrative error, nothing more. She'd been overworked, exhausted, and had simply failed to file one report among thousands. It happened. The war was chaos. Mistakes were inevitable. But Thornton kept digging. "Tell me about the consultation in December 1942, he demanded during their 5th interrogation. "You spent 3 days with von Lehmann. What did you discuss beyond official protocols?" "Military communications," Catherine replied, her voice mechanical. "Code structures. Nothing personal. Witnesses say you were alone with him during an air raid. For less than 5 minutes in a doorway. Hardly enough time for espionage, Major." Thornton leaned forward. "I don't think you're a spy, Miss Winters. I think you're something worse. A brilliant woman who fell for enemy charm and compromised her judgment. And that makes you a security risk." He was right. Catherine knew he was right. But she wouldn't give Friedrich up, even to save herself. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Catherine's colleagues, a quiet mathematician named Dr. Sarah Pemberton, requested a private meeting with Thornton. What she told him changed everything. "Major, I need to show you something," Sarah said, spreading decoded messages across his desk. "These are the Nightingale intercepts Miss Winters identified. I've been analyzing them since the investigation began." Thornton frowned. "And they're not love letters, sir. They're intelligence." Sarah's hands trembled as she explained. Von Lehmann was sending coded warnings about Wehrmacht movements, hidden within poetry. Miss Winters recognized the pattern and used the information to help predict German operations. Her work saved lives, Major. Hundreds of lives. It was a lie. A beautiful, carefully constructed lie that Sarah had built from fragments of truth and mathematical probability. The Nightingale messages had contained no actionable intelligence. But they could have, and Sarah had created a paper trail suggesting they did. She was risking her own career to save Catherine's. Thornton studied the documents, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up at Sarah. "Can you prove this?" "The operational successes speak for themselves, sir. Cross-reference the dates of the Nightingale intercepts with Allied victories in the relevant sectors. The correlation is statistically significant." It wasn't, but it was close enough to be plausible. Thornton sat back, defeated by mathematics he couldn't fully understand. Why didn't Miss Winters report this at the time? "Because von Lehmann was still operational, sir. Revealing that we'd broken his code would have ended his usefulness. Miss Winters was protecting an intelligence asset. Another lie, but a convincing one." 3 days later, Catherine was reinstated with a formal apology and a promotion. Thornton's investigation was quietly closed, his suspicions officially dismissed as overzealousness. Sarah never spoke of what she'd done, and Catherine never asked why. But the damage was done. Catherine's cottage was now under surveillance. Her mail was monitored. Any attempt to contact Friedrich, if he'd somehow survived, would be immediately detected. The investigation had ended, but the watching never would. She was trapped in her own life, unable to reach the one person who mattered. Switzerland, August 1944, Friedrich learned of the investigation through underground channels. Refugees who'd fled to Switzerland carried news from Britain, including rumors about a security crisis at Bletchley Park. He didn't know the details, but he knew Catherine's name had been mentioned. He understood immediately what had happened. His desertion, his disappearance, had put her under suspicion. By trying to protect her, he'd endangered her. Friedrich made a decision that tore him apart. He would not contact her. Not now. Not while the war continued. Any attempt to reach her would only confirm the suspicions against her. He had to let her believe he was dead, at least until the war ended and the surveillance stopped. It was the only way to keep her safe, but it meant breaking his promise. Bletchley Park. September 1944, Catherine received a package through the Red Cross. Personal effects recovered from the Eastern Front, belonging to Hauptmann Friedrich von Lehmann. Inside was his Wehrmacht identification, his officer's insignia, and a letter. Not from him. About him. To whom it may concern. The bearer of these items was killed in action, October 1943. His body was recovered and buried in accordance with military protocol. These effects are returned to his family per international law. The letter was signed by a Soviet officer. Catherine stared at the identification card, at Friedrich's photograph looking back at her with those intelligent, haunted eyes. This was proof. Official proof. Not missing anymore. Dead. Confirmed. Buried somewhere in the frozen Russian earth. She should have felt relief. The uncertainty was over. Instead, she felt nothing at all. That night, she took the package to her cottage and added it to the leather box beneath the floorboards. His photograph. His letters. His identification. All the pieces of a love that had never had a chance to exist outside of words and stolen moments. She sealed the box with wax and wrote on the lid, Niemals öffnen. Never open. Then Catherine Winters returned to Bletchley Park and continued breaking codes. Her heart as encrypted as any message she'd ever decoded. The war ground on. The nightingale never sang again. Germany. May 1945, the war ended on a Tuesday. Friedrich heard the news in a Swiss refugee camp, surrounded by hundreds of displaced souls trying to comprehend that the nightmare had finally ended. Around him, people wept with relief. He felt only emptiness. For years. He'd waited 4 years to keep his promise. Within days, he began the journey back to Britain. It should have been simple. The war was over, borders were opening, refugees were being repatriated. But nothing about post-war Europe was simple. The continent was a chaos of displaced persons, destroyed infrastructure, and bureaucratic nightmares. Former Wehrmacht officers, even deserters, were not welcome anywhere. It took Friedrich 3 months to secure the necessary papers, to prove he'd deserted, to convince skeptical Allied officials that he wasn't a war criminal hiding among refugees. Every day of delay was agony, knowing Catherine believed him dead, knowing she might have moved on, knowing his promise was already 4 years broken. Finally, in August 1945, he stepped off a boat in Dover, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and Catherine's address burned into his memory. The Cotswolds, August 15th, 1945. Catherine had returned to her cottage for the first time since the war ended. Bletchley Park was being dismantled, its secrets sealed under the Official Secrets Act. She'd been offered a position in the new peacetime intelligence service, but she'd declined. She wanted nothing more to do with codes, with secrets, with the machinery of war. She wanted to disappear into quiet obscurity and try to forget. The cottage looked smaller than she remembered, shabbier. For years of neglect had taken their toll. She spent the morning cleaning, trying not to think about the box hidden beneath the floorboards, trying not to remember why she'd hidden it. The knock came at 2 p.m. Catherine almost didn't answer. She wasn't expecting anyone. The village knew she valued her privacy. But something instinct, hope, madness, made her open the door. Friedrich stood on her doorstep. He was thinner than she remembered, his face lined with experiences she couldn't imagine. He wore civilian clothes that didn't quite fit, and his hands shook as he held out a piece of paper. The address she'd given him 3 years ago, creased and stained and obviously carried for thousands of miles. "I promised," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I'm late. I know you probably thought I was dead. I know I have no right to be here. But I promised I would come, and Catherine pulled him inside and kissed him. For a long moment, they simply held each other, both of them shaking, both of them crying, both of them unable to believe the other was real. "They sent me your identification," Catherine finally whispered against his shoulder. "The Red Cross. They said you were dead. They said you were buried in Russia." "I deserted," Friedrich said. "I walked away from my post and disappeared. They must have assumed I was killed. I tried to contact you, but I couldn't risk. If British intelligence had intercepted, you would have been arrested for—" "I know." Catherine pulled back to look at him, really look at him. "I know why you didn't write. I understand. But Friedrich, I waited. Even after they said you were dead, some part of me kept waiting. I'm so sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I broke my promise. I'm sorry I'm 4 years late. I'm sorry for everything." "You're here now," Catherine said. "That's what matters. You kept your promise. You came back to me." They spent that evening sitting by the fire, filling in the gaps of 4 years lived in parallel but separate. Friedrich told her about the Eastern Front, about his desertion, about the long months in Switzerland watching the war grind toward its inevitable conclusion. Catherine told him about the investigation, about Sarah's sacrifice, about the box beneath the floorboards. "I need to show you something," she said finally. She pried up the floorboard and retrieved the leather box, its wax seal still intact. Together they opened it. Inside were all the pieces of their impossible love. His photograph, his letters, his identification, her responses. Physical proof that what they'd shared had been real, not just a wartime delusion. And at the bottom of the box, one final letter. The one Catherine had written when she thought he was being sent to the Eastern Front. The one that had never been delivered. Friedrich read it with tears streaming down his face. "I will wait. I don't care how long. I will wait for you to keep your promise. Come back to me. Please come back to me." "You did wait," he whispered. "Even when you had every reason not to. You waited." "I loved you," Catherine said simply. "Love doesn't stop just because someone dies. Or because they're the enemy. Or because the world says it's impossible. I loved you, and that was stronger than everything else." Friedrich pulled a small object from his pocket. A ring, simple and worn, that had belonged to his mother. "I carried this through Russia, through Switzerland, through everything. I always meant to give it to you. I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other outside of letters, but—" "Yes," Catherine interrupted. "Whatever you're asking, the answer is yes." The Cotswolds. September 1945, they married quietly in the village church, with Sarah Pemberton as witness. There was no celebration, no announcement. Catherine's family was horrified. Marrying a German, even a deserter, even after the war ended, was social suicide. Friends turned away. Neighbors whispered. Catherine didn't care. They built a life in the cottage, far from London, far from the past. Friedrich found work as a translator. Catherine took a position teaching mathematics at a local school. They never spoke publicly about how they'd met, about the letters, about the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. It was their secret, sealed as tightly as any code Catherine had ever broken. But secrets have a way of surviving. The Cotswolds. October 1945, 1 month after their wedding. Major Thornton appeared at their door. "Miss Winters, Mrs. von Lehman, I suppose I should say." His voice was cold. I think we need to have a conversation about your husband's wartime activities and about why you failed to report that a German officer you were supposedly using as an intelligence asset had, in fact, survived the war and was now living in Britain under questionable legal status. Catherine felt ice flood through her veins. She'd been so focused on the miracle of Friedrich's survival that she hadn't considered the legal implications. He was technically an enemy alien, a deserter, possibly subject to war crimes investigation simply for having worn the uniform. And she had married him without reporting his presence to authorities. Friedrich stepped forward, placing himself between Catherine and Thornton. "I'll answer any questions you have, Major. But my wife had nothing to do with my desertion or my return. She believed I was dead until I appeared on her doorstep. If anyone is to be investigated, it should be me alone." Thornton studied them both, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "I'm not here officially, von Lehmann. I'm here because I owe your wife a debt." He looked at Catherine. "Dr. Pemberton came to me after the war ended. She told me the truth about the Nightingale messages, that they were personal, not intelligence. She told me what she'd done to protect you." Catherine's heart stopped. "She asked me to let it go," Thornton continued. "To let you have your happiness after everything you'd sacrificed for the war effort. And against my better judgment, I agreed." He turned back to Friedrich. "Your papers are in order. Your desertion is documented. You're legally allowed to remain in Britain as a refugee. But von Lehmann, if I ever discover you were involved in anything beyond what you've claimed, I will destroy you both. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, Major," Friedrich said quietly. Thornton nodded and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth, Mrs. von Lehmann, I hope you find the peace you've earned. God knows you've paid for it." Then he was gone, and Catherine and Friedrich were alone again, their impossible love somehow, miraculously, allowed to continue. The Cotswolds, 1946 to 1950, the years after the war, were not easy. Britain was rebuilding, rationing continued, and suspicion of Germans, even German deserters who'd opposed the regime, ran deep. Friedrich and Catherine lived quietly, almost invisibly, building their life in careful increments. Friedrich never spoke German in public. He anglicized his name to Frederick Lehmann, dropping the aristocratic von that marked him as other. He worked as a translator for academic publishers, his gift for languages allowing him to remain useful while staying out of sight. Catherine returned to mathematics, teaching at the local grammar school, and occasionally consulting on cryptographic problems for the government, though she refused any position that would require her to return to intelligence work. She'd had enough of secrets. They never had children. It was a mutual decision, made without discussion but understood completely. The world they'd survived was too broken, too haunted, to bring new life into. Instead, they poured their love into their cottage, their garden, their quiet existence. But they kept the letters. Every few years, Catherine would take out the leather box, and they would read through their wartime correspondence, remembering the people they'd been when the world was ending. The letters became their private history, proof that they'd survived something impossible. "Promise me something," Catherine said one evening in 1950 as they sat reading by firelight. "If something happens to me, if I die first, promise you'll keep these letters. Don't destroy them. Someday, someone should know what we went through, what we survived." Friedrich kissed her forehead. "I promise, but you're not going anywhere." "We're none of us going anywhere," Catherine said softly. "We're all just waiting." The Cotswolds, 1963. Friedrich died first, suddenly, of a heart attack while working in the garden. He was 52 years old. Catherine found him among the roses he'd planted, a trowel still in his hand, gone before she could say goodbye. She buried him in the village churchyard, under a simple stone that read, "Frederick Lehmann, 1911 to 1963. He kept his promise. Catherine lived another 30 years, teaching mathematics until she retired, tending the garden Friedrich had loved, reading their letters on quiet evenings. She never remarried. She never spoke of the war except in the vaguest terms. She became the eccentric old woman in the cottage, kind but distant, respected but never quite understood. Before she died in 1993, at the age of 74, Catherine added one final letter to the box, a letter to whoever might find it, explaining everything. The truth about Bletchley Park, now declassified, about Friedrich's desertion, about their impossible love and the promise that had survived a war. She sealed the box again, hid it beneath the same floorboards, and left instructions in her will. The cottage and its contents to my great-niece, Eleanor Hartwell. Tell her to look beneath the floor in the bedroom. Tell her the truth is there waiting. The Cotswolds. 2015, and 70 years after the war ended, I found it. I found the box, the letters, the photograph of my grandmother standing beside a man in a Wehrmacht uniform, both of them smiling with impossible hope. I found the truth that my family had buried, the secret that explained why Grandma Catherine had always seemed so distant, so haunted, so alone even when surrounded by family. She'd given her heart to a German officer during the war, and she'd never gotten it back. I read every letter. I traced their journey from forbidden love to impossible promise to miraculous survival. I learned about the investigation, about Sarah Pemberton's sacrifice, about Major Thornton's unexpected mercy. I discovered that my grandmother had been a hero at Bletchley Park, that she'd helped win the war while falling in love with the enemy. And I understood, finally, why she'd made me promise to open the box. Because some love stories are too powerful to stay buried forever. London, 2015. I'm standing in the Imperial War Museum, looking at an exhibit about Bletchley Park. There's a photograph of the codebreakers, young women in 1940s dresses, standing in front of Hut 8. And there, in the back row, almost invisible, is my grandmother, Catherine Winters, age 24, genius mathematician, keeper of secrets. The placard says she worked on German naval codes, that her work helped save countless lives. It doesn't mention the Nightingale messages, or the German officer who sent them, or the impossible love that survived when everything else was destroyed. But I know, and now you know too. I've spent the last 3 months researching their story, tracking down records, interviewing the few surviving Bletchley Park veterans who remember Grandma Catherine. Most of them are gone now, but those who remain speak of her with reverence, brilliant, dedicated, unshakable. None of them knew about Friedrich. I found his desertion papers in German military archives. I found the Red Cross letter that mistakenly declared him dead. I found the record of his arrival in Britain in 1945, and the record of his marriage to Catherine Winters 1 month later. I found Major Thornton's file, still partially classified, with a note in the margin. Case closed. No further action required. I found Sarah Pemberton's obituary from 1987. She never married, devoted her life to mathematics, died quietly in Cambridge. There was no mention of what she'd done to save my grandmother's career, no recognition of her sacrifice. But I know, and I'm making sure her story is remembered too. I've donated the letters to the Imperial War Museum, with the stipulation that they be displayed alongside Grandma Catherine's photograph. The museum is planning a special exhibit, Love in Wartime, the impossible romance of a codebreaker and a deserter. It will open next year, on the 70th anniversary of VE Day. People will see the letters, read their words, understand what it meant to love across enemy lines during the worst war in human history. They'll see the photograph of Catherine and Friedrich, young and hopeful and impossibly brave. They'll learn about the promise that survived everything. And maybe, just maybe, They'll understand that love doesn't stop for war or ideology or fear. That sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is love someone the world tells you is impossible to love. I'm writing this in Grandma Catherine's cottage, sitting at the desk where she once decoded messages that changed the course of history. Outside, Friedrich's roses are blooming, 70 years old, still surviving, still beautiful. Some things endure. Some promises are kept. Some love stories refuse to die. So tell me, which part of this story surprised you the most? The secret letters? The investigation? The fact that they actually found each other after the war? Leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories from World War II. Because history isn't just about battles and politics. It's about people and love and the impossible things we do to survive. Thank you for listening to their story. Thank you for making sure it's never forgotten.